Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. I hope you're all feeling well and that you've been enjoying these past few lectures on market structure. Now, we have got to cover a lot of ground in today's lecture and in the next lecture because these are the penultimate and ultimate lectures in microeconomics. Today, we will continue discussion on oligopoly. Remember, we discussed oligopolistic structures of market in our previous lecture. So we'll conclude that discussion. Then we'll get a chance to talk about welfare economics, where we will introduce the concept of externalities and market failure. And if we are lucky, we'll also get a chance to talk about the market for factors of production. Now, if you remember, we noted in our previous lecture that an oligopoly was similar to some of the other market structures in certain ways, but it was crucially different in two ways. And the first one was that in oligopolies, the results of a firm's actions depend not just on its own actions, but it depends on the actions of other firms or rival firms. So when one firm, let's say firm A, which is operating within an oligopoly, takes a decision, a pricing decision or an output decision, the implications for its quantity sold, for its profits, are not immediately derivable from its own actions. You need to analyze what the other players in the market might do in response to this particular firm or firm A's actions. And we developed some game theoretic approaches in our previous lecture. We set up payoff matrices in which we put in some numbers and said that if firm A did this, then firm B could respond in this way. It could either cut its price or keep its price the same. And then we analyzed the different payoffs and identified the dominant strategy for firm A. And based on that dominant strategy, we saw that it is often the case that when oligopolistic firms are not colluding with each other, they might choose strategies in which both the firms or all the firms are worse off. And this we called the prisoner's dilemma. And I also gave you the example of the actual prisoner's dilemma. Now, I also mentioned that unlike the other types of market structures like perfect competition, monopoly, and monopolistic competition, there was no single theory, unified theory of the oligopoly. And this was the second difference that oligopoly had vis-a-vis other market structures. I'm going to develop this thought a little bit further. And in fact, I'm going to say today that there are actually some theories about oligopoly as well. It's not as if this type of market structure is theory-less. And the theory that I want to talk about today is that of price stability in non-collusive oligopolies. This idea was developed by two economists on opposite sides of the Atlantic in the 1930s. And it was based on two asymmetric assumptions. Let me first give you the background of why this theory was needed, or what was the inspiration for this theory. These economists observed that when oligopolists were not cooperating with each other, it was highly likely to see a price war in that industry. So you can imagine if there are just 4 or 5 players in a market and they're all competing for the same customers and they are not cooperating with each other, then it's very likely that each one of them will try to charge a lower price and snatch the customers from the other player. So each firm will try to maximize its sales and its profits. And they will try to do it at the expense of the other rival firms. Now, in this particular situation, you can imagine why when one firm cuts its price, the other firms would also cut their price, right? Because they would not want to lose their customers. So you could expect a price war to result in non-collusive oligopolies. And then once they've all cut their prices, and then they're all crying over the low profits that they're making, then the incentive to collude becomes strong again, and that is when such oligopolists get together and decide to charge high prices again. And we saw how this oscillatory nature of collusion and non-collusion occurred in the case of the OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. So it was natural to expect price fluctuations in oligopolies, especially non-collusive oligopolies, where there was instability in terms of what each of the market participants, each of the firms was trying to do. However, when economists looked at the evidence in some of these markets, they looked at the automobiles market, they looked at the cement market, they looked at the chemicals industry, they found prices to be remarkably stable, or more stable than they had at least expected to find them. And they wondered why this was the case, and this is when these two economists, one in Europe and one in America, they came together in the 1930s and gave this theory of the kinked demand curve. The theory of the kinked demand curve rests on two asymmetric assumptions, which I mentioned earlier. And these assumptions are namely as follows. The first assumption is that when an oligopoly is operating and there is one particular oligopolist who cuts his price, then all the other oligopolists will have to cut their prices as well. Right? That makes sense. That is, if one firm cuts his price, then the other firms will also have to cut their prices. Otherwise, the customers will simply leave these other firms and rush to buy their goods from the firm which has now cut its price. So when a unilateral decision to cut the price of goods happens in an oligopolistic structure, all the firms have to cut their price as well. That's one part of the story. The other assumption, and this is where the asymmetry arises, is that when one firm in a non-collusive setting, when one firm decides to raise its price, what do the other firms do? Will they raise their price as well? No. They will simply sit back and think, well, this one guy is acting stupid, so let him act stupid, and we will actually gain by his raising the price because his customers will now buy the product from us. Remember that oligopolists face downward sloping demand curves, right? So if the demand curve is not like totally inelastic, there is some elasticity there. So when a particular oligopolist raises his price, consumers will buy less from him and will be inclined to buy the same product from other people who are selling it at a lower price. So this is where the asymmetry arises in this theory of the kinked demand curve. That is, when a single individual oligopolist raises his price, the other oligopolists will not follow suit. They will not raise their price. However, when a single oligopolist lowers his price, everybody will rush to lower their prices as well. Let's illustrate through some diagrams how this actually occurs and how this leads to price stability in a non-collusive oligopoly. Let's go to our slide. Now, due to the two assumptions that I have mentioned, each oligopolist will face a demand curve that is kinked at the current price and output, as can be seen from the diagram. A rise in price will lead to a large fall in sales as customers switch to the now lower-priced rivals. The firm will thus be reluctant to raise its price. Demand is relatively elastic above the kink, but on the other hand, a fall in price will bring only a modest increase in sales since rivals lower their prices too, and therefore customers do not switch. The firm will thus also be reluctant or hesitant to lower its price. Demand is relatively inelastic below the kink, and thus the oligopolists will be reluctant to change prices at all. This price stability can be shown formally by drawing in the firm's marginal revenue curve, and this is done in this next diagram. To see how this happens, imagine dividing the diagram into two parts on either side of Q1. At quantities less than Q1, that is the left-hand part of the diagram, the marginal revenue curve will correspond to the shallow or flatter part of the average revenue curve. Remember, average revenue curve is simply the demand curve. Now, at quantities greater than Q1, that is the right-hand part, the marginal revenue curve will correspond to the steep part of the AR curve. To see how this part of the MR curve is constructed, imagine extending the steep part of the AR curve back to the vertical axis. This and the corresponding marginal revenue curve are shown by the dotted lines. Now, as you can see, there will be a gap between points A and point B. In other words, there is a vertical section of the marginal revenue curve between these 2 points. And this is the specialty about this theory. Profits, as you know, will be maximized where marginal costs equal marginal revenue. But in this particular case, there is no unique point at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue. There are a number of points at which this equality can hold. Thus, if the marginal cost curve lies anywhere between MC1 and MC2, which correspond to points B and point A respectively, the profit maximizing price and output will be P1 and Q1. Thus, prices will remain stable even with a considerable change in costs. That is, for any marginal cost curve between points A and B, the oligopolist will choose quantity Q1 and price P1. Now, despite the powerful implications of this theory, that is, it is able to explain price stability even in non-collusive oligopolies, there are a number of shortcomings of this theory, but they are beyond the scope of this course, so you do not need to worry about them. Now, given that segment of our discussion on oligopoly, let's switch to a part of our discussion which has been a feature of our discussion of monopolies and perfect competition and monopolistic competition. And as I promised in the previous lecture, we will talk about this in the context of oligopolies as well, and that is the relationship between oligopolies and public interest, the interest of public at large, the interest of society. Now, what particular concerns does oligopoly raise for public interest? In terms of the disadvantages, one can think of two major disadvantages. And that is that when oligopolies collude with each other, oligopolistic firms collude with each other, that is, they cooperate with each other and form a cartel, then while they enjoy monopoly power in terms of the prices that they charge, they are not deriving or leveraging the cost benefits, the average cost benefits that would have been derived if a single firm was operating in the market. So remember that scale economies or economies of scale were a major reason why we said that natural monopolies should be allowed to exist. Because if the average cost curve is falling for a large segment of the output, it makes sense only to have a single firm producing for the entire market. However, with an oligopoly, when you have 4 or 5 different firms, they are not able to get the same kind of scale economies. That is, they are not able to go down to the lower level of the average cost curve because each of them can't produce that same high level of quantity because the market is split between them. And therefore, scale economies cannot be leveraged in an economy, in an oligopoly, to the extent that they can in a monopoly. So the major disadvantage here is that while oligopolists are enjoying monopoly power in a cartel, they are not giving to society the cost benefits that would have arisen if they were actually a monopoly. The second disadvantage of oligopolies relative to a monopoly is that unlike monopolists who do not need to advertise a lot because there are no other firms, if you are the only firm in the market, you do not need to advertise a lot. However, when you are an oligopoly or when you are operating in a situation where there are 4 or 5 or 10, 15 major firms, and each of those firms is vying for the same consumers, is competing for the same customers, advertising expenditures are likely to be extremely high in such markets. You will therefore find soft drink producers competing very strongly with each other on advertising expenditures. A lot of the costs of oligopolists are actually advertising and marketing costs. And we will come to discuss why advertising in itself is not the best possible way to spend the precious resources that a firm has. Now, those were two important disadvantages, and we will come to the advertising part of the disadvantage a little while later. But let's talk about the particular advantages that an oligopoly offers for public interest. The first advantage is that in an oligopoly, firms are able to make supernormal profits. And we noted that this was also a feature of monopolies. Both monopolies and oligopolies can allow for supernormal profits in the long run. This was not an option, remember, for perfectly competitive or monopolistically competitive firms. So now, once these oligopolistic firms are making supernormal profits, we need to see whether their incentive to invest these profits in cost reduction techniques or product improvement methods is more than monopolies or less than monopolies. Think about it. Would 5 or 6 firms making supernormal profits be more inclined to spend that money on cost minimization or product quality improvement than if the supernormal profits were being made by a single firm? Certainly. If 5 or 6 firms are competing with each other in an oligopolistic structure, then they would be more eager to spend the profits that they make on this cost minimization techniques and to make their production processes more efficient, to improve the quality of their product so that they will be able to snatch a bigger share of the market. So this is the major advantage that oligopolies have vis-a-vis monopolies in reference to profits. Now, final advantage of oligopolies is that through non-price competition, that is product differentiation and advertising, sometimes these firms can produce a variety of goods that would otherwise not be available to consumers. So think of the car market or think of the stereo market. There are a number of different brands offering different configurations. Some of these stereo equipment might have higher wattage, some might have decks, tapes, radio, everything combined. Some might be small in size, some might be big. So there are different types of the same kind of product, but which are tailor-made for different types of needs of consumers. So this is something that oligopolistic market structures allow for, because product differentiation is an important feature, and then they can ensure that advertising expenditure can help sustain those differentiated products in the market. Now, we've talked about advertising again and again. We talked about advertising in our discussion of elasticity. We talked about advertising as a barrier to entry that could be used by monopolies. And we've now talked about advertising as a major way of non-price competition for oligopolistic firms. But economists debate quite a lot about whether advertising in itself is something desirable or not desirable as regards public interest. That is, whether society benefits from advertising per se or whether it does not. Now, the debate is not conclusive. You might have seen ads on television which say, advertising your right to choose, right? And you might have also heard firms passionately advocating for the need or the freedom to advertise because they feel that it's a major way of putting across their message to consumers. And there's no doubt about that. Advertising has many advantages. The first advantage being that it allows product information to reach consumers. It allows firms to tell consumers what products they are manufacturing, what products they are selling, and it can also aid product development because firms can stress the particular features of new products, right? The features that they think are most liked by consumers. That's one advantage. Another advantage is that advertising allows firms to break into markets that they would otherwise not be able to break into. So, for example, if there are certain brands which are established in a market, and if a new good brand comes in, if it were not for advertising and the ability of advertising to convey to consumers the existence of this new brand and the particular attractive features that this new brand offers, then the firm would have no way to sell that brand in the market. People would just continue to buy the existing brand. So in terms of breaking into new markets and introducing new products, advertising is key. Another advantage is that advertising can encourage price competition between firms, certainly in oligopolies. So for example, if you see advertisements of soap or shampoos or toothpaste on television telling you that the price of a particular product has been cut or that there is a special offer on a particular product, what do you think the impact of that is on other people or other firms who are producing the same product? When one brand or the producer of one brand cuts its prices and advertises this, then other producers are also forced to cut their prices. And this encourages price competition, and this is definitely in the public interest. Finally, if advertising helps a firm increase its level of sales, then that means that the firm will be able to operate at a higher output and therefore leverage greater economies of scale. As we noted earlier, when you have a monopoly, the monopolist can operate at a very large output and therefore can have very low average costs at that level of output that it is producing at. And therefore, it can pass some of that low cost benefit to consumers by charging a lower price. The same analogy holds for oligopolies as well. An oligopolistic firm, as it becomes bigger, whether through advertising or other non-price competition or price competition, when it becomes bigger, that is, it develops a bigger market share, it can leverage scale economies. That is, if there are scale economies in the market, and then it can pass some of the benefit of the lower costs to consumers. Now, these were the advantages of advertising. What's the other side? What are the disadvantages? What are the arguments against advertising? Well, economists say that advertising is a waste of money. That is, advertising costs money. It costs resources, economic resources. And what are those economic resources being spent on? They are being spent on merely telling consumers about products that have already been produced. Those scarce and precious economic resources, those advertising dollars, could have been better spent in actually producing more goods in the economy. If you remember, we defined the major economic problem as that of scarcity. That is, human wants were greater than what could be produced to satisfy those wants. So what economists are not happy about is that advertising does not do anything to alleviate or solve the problem of scarcity. That is, the money that could have been spent on producing more goods and relieving the problem of scarcity is now spent on advertising, right? And what is more, advertising increases human wants. You are encouraging people to buy more goods. You are encouraging people to buy different brands and spend more. And therefore, their desire or their wants increase. And when this happens, the difference between wants and the goods available to satisfy those wants increases, and that exacerbates or worsens the problem of scarcity. There is also the ethical issue of advertising misleading consumers into buying a product that's actually not good. So, for example, there is a particular brand which is being heavily advertised on television, and you are influenced by it, so you go to the market and buy that brand. But there is another brand sitting right there next to that brand on the shelf, but the owner of that brand is not advertising the product on television. This does not mean that the product that is being advertised on television is necessarily better than the product which is not being advertised. It could exactly be the opposite. It could be that the product which is not being advertised is a better quality product or gives you better value for money, but you simply don't buy it because it's not being advertised as intensely. One final cost of advertising or disadvantage of advertising, which is important to economists and which will lead us into a discussion of externalities and social costs, is that advertising has certain other costs attached to it which are not priced into the cost of advertising by firms. When firms think about how much to advertise, they're only thinking about the marginal cost of advertising to them. So they're merely thinking, okay, how much does it cost me to put up an additional advertisement in the newspaper or put up an additional advertisement on television? They are not thinking about the costs of advertising to consumers or television viewers in general. For example, it might be the case that consumers don't like to watch so many advertisements. In fact, sometimes the advertisements are annoying, they are tasteless, they happen right in the middle of a very interesting drama that's happening, and you don't want to see that particular ad. Obviously, that's a cost to society as well. People are suffering because of those ads, and they're really sometimes very bad quality ads that are shown on television. So that particular cost is not priced in by firms when they are deciding how much to advertise. Now, this problem that I've mentioned to you of firms which are advertising or which use advertising as a means of informing customers about their product, this point that they do not factor in or they do not include or incorporate the costs to society at large of the annoying nature of certain advertisements reflects a much deeper problem in economics, and that is of externalities. We talked about external economies of scale in our discussion of costs, and we saw that it is possible for a firm to be affected by what is happening in the industry as a whole. That is, it can be affected positively or negatively by developments in the industry or developments which are external to the firm. That is not internal to the firm, external to the firm. And we use the terms external economies of scale and external diseconomies of scale there. Now, the same principle applies for any firm producing a particular good. When a firm produces a certain good, it might have externalities for society or for other industries. That is, it could have an impact on other industries or consumers at large, and the firm, when producing this, does not or is not able to factor this into its output decisions. So we need to distinguish here between marginal social costs and marginal private costs. Marginal private costs of producing a good is the cost that the firm itself incurs in dollars of producing an extra unit of output. Whereas marginal social cost is the marginal private cost that the firm incurs plus any other cost that is borne by society because of the production of the additional good. Now let me illustrate these 2 points about social costs and externalities through the use of a simple example. Think of a chemicals industry, an industry which produces certain chemicals for either drug making or for other purposes, right? And when it produces these chemicals, it also produces certain byproducts or certain waste material. And these are highly toxic material. And what it does is that it throws that toxic material into the river. So the discharge, the toxic discharge from the production of the chemical, which will then be sold by the firm, the toxic discharge or the unwanted byproduct is thrown into the river. And the effect of that on the river is that all the fish in the river die as a result of the toxic material or the poison that is being thrown into the river. Also, that river might be the supply line or the water supply source for many farmers further down the river. So it might be supplying water to many fields where people are growing crops. And the toxic nature of the water after it has been polluted by the chemical firm may not allow those farmers to produce those crops, or the crops that are produced are poisonous in some way, right? So this is something which is a good example of an externality. It is an externality because the production process of the firm has an impact on people outside the firm. So it's a cost which is not borne by the chemical producing firm itself. It's a cost which is borne by the fishermen who are fishing in the rivers, and it is a cost which is borne by farmers. And both these industries, the farming industry and the fisheries industry, are separate from the chemicals industry. Therefore, we call the effects of this production of chemical on the farming and fisheries industry as an externality to the firm which is responsible for producing this pollution. Now, externalities are a very common phenomenon in society. They happen everywhere around us. Whenever firms produce any goods, they usually throw out a lot of smoke. When cars are running on the road, the person who is driving the car might only be concerned about the cost of petrol or the cost of maintaining the car. But because some of these cars and some of these buses throw out or belch out such a lot of smoke, they usually do not price the cost of that smoke to society in general, the cost of a polluted environment to society in general. And so this represents negative externalities. We call them negative externalities because they have a negative impact on society. Now, there can be positive externalities as well. So let me give you an example of what a positive externality would be. Think of yourself as setting up a nice garden in your house, and that you set up a nice row of roses. You plant the best roses in town, roses, red roses, white roses, yellow roses, and the smell or the perfume of those roses is very nice. It's very refreshing. But can you control the smell or perfume of those roses from going to your neighbor's house? No, you can't. So your neighbor also benefits from these roses that you've planted. He can also smell the smell of the roses and he feels happy about it. So you should be encouraged to produce or plant more of these roses, because not only are they giving comfort to you, they're also giving comfort to your neighbor. So this is an example of a positive externality, when an action of a certain person affects not only himself, but affects somebody else in a positive way. Now let me give you a graphical illustration of the earlier example of negative externality, and illustrate to you what the implications of that are for the socially optimum level of production of the chemical. And let's illustrate and see if there is a possible role for the government in ensuring that the society produces the chemical or that particular output at the optimal level. Let's go to our slide. Now here we have a graph of the demand and supply position of a chemical producing firm. Usually chemicals industries are oligopolies. So we assume that there is a downward sloping demand curve and therefore a downward sloping marginal revenue curve as well. Then we have the marginal cost curve of the oligopolist, and as usual it's a rising curve which is going from left to right in an upward direction. Now on the vertical axis, we have the price of the chemical being sold in the market. That is the price of 1 unit or 1 ton of chemical that the firm sells in the market. And on the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of chemical produced. This is the good chemical that is produced, not the bad one. But note that I have written that the quantity of the good chemical produced is proportional to the quantity of the bad pollutant which is produced. That is, as you produce more and more of the good chemical, the quantity of the bad byproduct or the pollutant also increases. Now, let's see what the implications of this situation are for the optimal point of production for society. Now, if the firm, the chemical producing firm, took account of its marginal costs and marginal revenues only, that is, of its marginal private costs and marginal revenue only, it would produce at output level Q1. That is the point of intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue curves. And he will choose a price of P1. However, as I mentioned earlier, the production of the pollutant causes a negative externality for farmers and fishers. And therefore, that cost needs to be incorporated in our analysis as well. So the actual cost of society of producing an extra good or an extra unit of the chemical will be represented by a vertical raising of the marginal cost curve. So the marginal cost curve will shift upwards to give a marginal social cost curve. And the amount by which the marginal private cost curve shifts upward will be equal to the amount of externality. That is the dollar effect of 1 unit of chemical on the fisheries or the fishermen or on the farmers. Now, as you can see, the new decision rule for the firm, if it were to pay attention to the marginal social cost, would be that it would operate or it would choose its output at Q2. This is the level where the marginal social cost, not the marginal private cost, the marginal social cost curve intersects the marginal revenue line. And therefore, the price that the firm charges for the product is P2. So as you can see, quantity has been reduced and price has been increased. And so it should be. This is a chemical which is causing a pollutant to be produced as a byproduct. If you do not take account of this, then you would produce at the higher level of Q1 and charge a lower price P1. But now, when you have incorporated the overall effects on society of this product, then you can understand the negative effects that this is having on society, and therefore you would not like to produce as much of the quantity as you produced earlier, and therefore the quantity falls to Q2. This now represents the socially optimal level. Now the illustration here can also be explained in the context of a perfectly competitive firm. A perfectly competitive firm can also be confronted with a situation where it is causing negative externalities of production. Look at this diagram here. Here you have two curves similarly, marginal private cost curve and marginal social cost curve. And you have a demand curve. And at the price P1, price is equals to marginal private cost. And therefore the perfectly competitive firm will produce at output level Q1, and the price is obviously given at P1. Now if the perfectly competitive firm were to pay attention to the marginal social cost, he would produce at output level Q2 and charge or get up the price in the market would be P2. Now the area of the triangle ABC in this case enables us to calculate or get a measure of the social cost of the externality. The externality is obviously BC, the vertical distance, but the triangle ABC, that area gives us a measure of the social cost of the externality. This social cost is eliminated if the perfectly competitive firm operates at output level Q2 and the price prevailing is P2. Now the important question to ask at this stage is there a way that the government can ensure that the socially optimal level of the chemical is produced and not the level that the firm itself thinks is optimal? That is, the social costs of the production of that pollutant are also, the social costs of the production of the chemical are also duly taken into account. The answer is yes. The government can possibly play three types of roles. It can try to provide more information about the pollutant that is being produced by the firm and the negative effects it is having on the fishermen and on the farmers. And then it can leave it to society to place some checks on that local chemical producing firm. The society can say to the firm that if you produce this pollutant, it will harm our livelihoods and therefore we will shut down your plant. That's one possible option. But often it is not successful. Firms are powerful, and if not checked by the government directly, then they can continue to do what they want to. Another way that the government can intervene is to remain within the market setup and impose a tax on the firm which is equal to the size of the externality. What the tax simply does, if you remember your lectures on supply very well, or of equilibrium, a tax simply raises the supply curve, shifts it vertically upwards, and therefore increases the market clearing price and reduces the market clearing quantity. Let's illustrate this through the use of a slide. Now, as you can see here, the government can impose a tax on the chemical producer equal in size to the vertical distance BC. The result of this tax would be to raise the marginal price width cost curve up to the marginal social cost curve level, and therefore lead to a quantity Q2 being produced and a price P2, which is a higher price being charged. Note that the revenues that the government will get from imposing this tax, that is the tax which is equal to the externality, the revenues that it gets from this chemical producing firm can then be used to clean up the river for the pollutant that has already entered the river, or because some quantity of the chemical is still being produced, some pollutant will be produced. So the government can use the tax revenues to clean up the river for the pollutant which is already part of the river. So this is one other type of response that the government can consider. A third response is regulation, where the government bypasses the market system totally and specifies the quality of product, the quality of byproducts that the firm will be allowed to discharge into the river. So the government can specify the degree of toxic waste that would be permissible under law for the firm to discharge. If the toxic waste which is being discharged is more intense or is worse than the level prescribed or allowed by the government, then the government could call upon the firm to shut down or simply close or ban the firm, right? And if it is below the level that is considered okay or appropriate by the government, then the firm would be allowed to continue. Now, often the regulation option is chosen to the tax option because when you want to impose a tax, you should know the exact size of the externality. And governments often don't know that. Therefore, they often choose the non-market option of simply specifying standards that firms have to follow in choosing what quantity of output to produce and what type of byproducts to discharge for the society at large. Now, this is just one particular example of market failure. When I say market failure, I mean a situation in which if the firm were left or the situation were left to market forces, the socially optimum result would not come about. So this is the case of market failure, and it requires some kind of intervention. Now, this is not the only type of market failure that can exist. If the government, for example, saw that a particular good had consumption externalities, that is positive consumption externalities, then there could also be a case of a subsidy. So think about education. If the government wants people to get more educated, but feels that the people themselves would not be able to or would not like to spend too much time raising their kids or teaching their kids or getting them into college and then university and getting them qualified for PhDs and master's degrees, then the government might want to encourage them by giving them subsidies or scholarships. Let's illustrate how this would happen through the use of a slide. Now, this is an example of a merit good, MERIT, that is a good, a good which the government would like to consume or would like consumers to consume more. And we take the example of higher education here. On the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of education that is being consumed by society. That is the number of years of schooling that, let's say, the average student is consuming. And the government would typically like to increase the number of years of schooling that an individual or a person has or receives. So it therefore might feel that the marginal social benefit of education is higher than the marginal private benefit, and therefore might decide to give a scholarship to students. This, as you know, would be the case when the government thinks that education has benefits for society as a whole that are not being priced, or that individual parents are not able to price in when they are deciding how much education to give to their son or daughter. So in this case, the government might provide a subsidy or a scholarship of amount Fk, which would shift the demand curve or the marginal private benefit curve to the right, where the new equilibrium point would be point L, where the price of education would have risen, but the quantity of education would have also risen to Q2. Note that the effective price that would be paid by the student would have actually fallen to P0 from P1, because LS is the amount of subsidy or scholarship that the government is paying. Now note that both these cases that we've discussed, the case in which the quantity of a good being produced was higher than what was the social optimum, and the case where which the quantity of a good being consumed was lower than the social optimum, both related to goods that were already existing in the market. That is, they were already being produced and consumed in the market. But in the case of public goods, a situation can arise that those goods might not even be produced in the market. And here is where we talk about the biggest case of market failure, that is in the provision of public goods. If left to the market, certain goods would never be produced. Let me give you a couple of examples. You live in a neighborhood and you need lights in the night. When the sun goes down, it's dark everywhere, and therefore you need someone to put street lights. Now, who will provide those street lights, or who will put up those street lights? Who will bear the cost of that? Will you bear it? Will your neighbor bear it? Will someone else bear it? Why would they bear it? The two problems with something like street lights is that the good is non-excludable and non-rival, and it's called a public good. When you say non-excludable, it means that when you put the street lights up, you cannot exclude somebody else from benefiting from those street lights as well. So if your house is situated in a street and there are 10 other houses on the same street, if you put up street lights on that street and you pay for those street lights, the other people will also benefit from the street light. That is, they will be free riders. They have benefited for free. In this case, property rights are not clearly defined. By property rights, I mean the ability for the person who has paid for something to exclude others from benefiting from the same thing. For example, if you were to buy a house and you were not allowed to exclude other people from coming into your house, you would not be willing to buy that house because the property rights are not clearly defined in your favor. This is exactly the case for public goods. Things like street lights would never be put up if they were left to the private sector. They have to be put up either by the community, right? So there can be a communal decision to put up the street lights together, so where every house contributes a little bit. That is one possible solution, or the government does it. And another example in which only the government can provide a public good is the example of defense, national security. Will any individual private firm be able to or can afford to provide national security? No. Defense has to be, or defense services have to be provided by the government. And through defense, you can also understand what non-rival mean. Non-rival means that when one person consumes a certain public good, it does not affect another person's ability to consume the good as well. So if you are consuming, or if you are being provided national security by the armed forces of Pakistan, then that does not mean that the fact that you are being protected, another person or your neighbor is not being protected, right? So it's different from when you consume, let's say, a soap or a banana or an apple. That is, when you consume an apple, you prevent somebody else from consuming the same apple as well. Either you can eat it or somebody else can eat it. But you can't both eat it together, right? But this is not the case for things like defense or clean air. These are called public goods, and it's one of the major cases in which market failures occur and where government intervention is often required. So, my friends, with that, we come to the end of today's lecture. Now, we've covered a lot of ground today. We concluded our discussion on oligopoly. We established the implications that oligopoly had for public interest. We zoomed in on advertising, which was something that oligopolistic firms relied heavily on for non-price competition. And we saw that advertising had its benefits and had its costs. And within costs, we identified social costs that any individual firm would not be able to price in at the time of deciding how much to advertise or what quantity of advertisements to put up on television or in the newspapers. And through that discussion of social costs, we started talking about welfare economics, or how social welfare or socially optimum levels of production could be decided or had to be decided based on marginal social cost analysis. That is, the social optimum points are those where the marginal revenue or the marginal social benefit equals the marginal social cost. We looked at examples of positive externalities, negative externalities, the possible government responses to these cases of market failure, and we also looked at what public goods were and how, if left to the market, these goods would never be produced. Now, in our next lecture, we will talk about the market for factors of production and information economics, the economics of information, and that will conclude our module on microeconomics. So till our next lecture, it is Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu alaikum.